Every journey begins with a single step. For our friend, the hydrogen atom, that step is a bold leap from being part of a water molecule to an emissary of energy. In the heart of an electrolysis chamber, powered by renewable energy, water is transformed. Oxygen steps back, releasing the vibrant hydrogen atom. Alone, hydrogen is volatile, but when paired with captured CO2 and the help of a touch of alchemy, together, they forge a potent synthetic fuel. A new energy carrier, clean, efficient, ready to power our world. Innovative companies are investing in the production of eFuels, which can then be distributed via the existing infrastructure to industry and consumers, providing them with a climate-friendly alternative to conventional fossil fuels. Aviation, maritime, heavy goods transport, even your car, eFuels power a wide range of sectors and offer a sustainable solution to our diverse energy and mobility needs. We at the eFuel Alliance embrace the entire value chain and give it a face and a voice. Our goal is political acceptance and regulatory consideration of eFuels as a significant contribution to sustainable climate protection. In the quest for green energy, eFuels are an essential piece of the puzzle, linking today's infrastructure to a more sustainable future. The eFuel Alliance is powering this transition, forging a path from hydrogen to hope, because the future of energy is now.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you all today to our event, Europe has voted in favor of eFuels. Having been in politics myself as a Minister of Environment in Lower Saxony and later as a member of the German Parliament, today's event is particularly close to my heart. More than 182 million people cast their vote in the European elections from 6 to 9 June, one of the greatest displays of the democracy in the world. And in our system, the ballot box is the ultimate arbiter, because when all the votes are counted, the politicians are the servants and the people are the masters. Policymakers are well advised not to take this simple but important principle lightly, for one basic reason. Unfortunately, the rise of radical parties, both on the extreme right and the extreme left at European level, has been evident for several years. While MEPs from far-right and Eurosceptic groups made up less than 10% of all MEPs 20 years ago, this figure has been steadily growing since the 2009 elections, climbing to nearly 16% in the 2014 elections and 18% in the 2019 elections. The result of Sunday night shows, once again, the trend could not be stopped. But how significant are the gains at the fringes? Is it more of a wave, or is it really a tsunami? And what does it mean to the center ground? What mandate have the voters given the new lawmakers, particularly in the policies areas on which we, the eFuel Alliance, focus? Will the new European Parliament in the coming EU political cycle be more determined to press for the necessary policy framework to enable to uptake eFuels? I'm delighted to welcome our two distinguished panelists today to discuss these virtual issues. And Dr. Manuel Müller is a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. His research focuses mainly on institutional reform on the EU and supranational democracy. Before joining FIAA, Manuel worked at the Institute of European Politics, IEP, in Berlin and the University to Duisburg-Essen. He will take a closer look at the outcome of the elections and provide an objective analysis of the results in order to understand better what it will take to form a stable majority in the coming EU term. How can the future candidate of the Commission President bridge the contrasting political convictions of political groups and secure Parliament's support? Can Social Democrats, Renew MEPs, and possibly the Greens support the EPP's election pledge and correct the ban of internal combustion engines to pursue a more technology-inclusive climate policy by acknowledging the role that renewable fuels can play in the decarbonization of the road transport? Our second expert, Dr. Robert Grimm, had been the head of public affairs at Ipsos, Germany, a multinational market research and consulting firm with headquarters in Paris since 2016. In this capacity, Robert has worked for national and international governmental and non-governmental organizations, political foundations, and academic research organizations. He holds a PhD from Manchester Metropolitan University, where he was a research fellow at the Policy Evaluation and Research Unit from 2009 to 2015. Robert is a renowned speaker on public opinion in Germany and Europe and knows what is on people's mind, what their concerns are, and what they expect politicians to address. He will give us an overview of the burning issues that move voters across Europe and were decisive in the way they cast their ballots. What do they expect from the European Union in the coming years? And what does this mean for climate policy measures in particular? At the time of the last election in 2019, the eFuel Alliance had not been founded. We have only been around since 2020. Since then, we have achieved a lot and established eFuels in the public and political debate. However, to empower governments, businesses, and people with climate-friendly solutions and speed up the phase-out of conventional fossil fuels, our member companies need a clear signal from the EU's institutions. They are primed to invest multi-million euro projects to help make the goal of climate neutrality a reality. We stand ready to be part of the solution and deliver for the planet, for the people, and our economy. Yet, to encourage much-needed investment and create a solid business case for eFuels, the right policy framework is essential. Ralf Diemer, CEO of the eFuel Alliance, will outline what is needed for a comprehensive strategy to boost the market penetration of eFuels. What EU policies are key to boosting production, and how can we best realize the net zero potential of eFuels? Dear panelists, esteemed audience, I'm looking forward to the upcoming presentations, and I'm eagerly awaiting your numerous questions. With this in mind, let's get started.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Also from me, a very warm welcome. An eventful week lies behind us. An even more intensive week lies ahead of us. Much has already been written and said about the outcome of the elections. I'm all the more delighted to see so many of you here with us today to discuss the results and what they could mean for the market ramp up of eFuels. Right now, I can see there are more than 80 people online with us. Having been following the work of Dr. Manuel Müller, who has an extensive understanding of the various national parties across Europe, in reading his articles in the run-up to the EU election, I'm pretty confident that he will be able to point out some interesting facts that might not be on your radar and provide you with some food for thoughts. Dr. Müller, the floor is yours, or to carry on the food metaphor, shall we serve?
So many thanks for the nice introduction. I will, without further ado, share my screen. And well, as has already been said, I'm going to present now some views into the and insights into the outcome of the recent European Parliament election and the possible majorities within the next parliament. Just as a reminder to start, here is the composition of the European Parliament. Currently, there are 7 groups in the parliament from left to right. These are the Left Group, the Greens and European Free Alliance, the Socialists and Democrats, the Centrist Liberal Renew Europe Group, the Conservative Christian Democrat European People's Party, and then the 2 far-right groups, the European Conservatives and Reformists, or ECR, and Identity and Democracy, or ID. And finally, there is a group of non-attached parties that do not belong to any other political group, among them the German AfD, the Hungarian Fidesz, and the Italian Five Stars movement. The pie that you can see on this screen is the outgoing European Parliament, which of course doesn't exist anymore. The new European Parliament now looks like this, or at least this is how you can normally see it when you are looking now for the current results. In the inner pie, you see the old parliament. In the outer pie, you see the new one. But if you look closely, basically everywhere where the actual European Parliament results are presented, there is still this group of other parties that isn't quite clear where it belongs right now, because simply there have been many new parties elected to the European Parliament who still have to decide which group they are going to join. And there are other parties who have already been in the European Parliament, but still are thinking about changing groups. So there is still a lot in flux in the formation of the political groups in the European Parliament, which is why I'm going to talk now mostly about what I call still a seat projection based on the results. And this is what I then call the dynamic scenario of the seat projection. In this dynamic scenario, all the so-called other parties have been assigned to some political group, the one that is most plausible as a target when they are now going to join a group. But just as a reminder, to keep in mind that this dynamic scenario can still change. It is very well possible that in a couple of days things will not look exactly as I present them here now. It will be more or less like this, but I'm not going to talk about any specific numbers here because well, things are still changing. So looking at this dynamic scenario, what are the big changes compared to the old parliament? On the one hand, the big winner of the European Parliament election has been the European People's Party, which has already been the strongest group before and is now strengthening its position as the strongest group. It may even come close to 200 seats in the European Parliament. On the other hand, the Socialists and Democrats are stable, but they had actually a very bad result in 2019. So being stable doesn't help them very much. They are still at historically low levels in the next European Parliament. The actual losers of this parliamentary elections have been the Greens and the Liberals. Still, it is important to remind that both had a very good result in 2019. There was talk about the so-called Green Wave, and also the Liberals were very successful back then when Emmanuel Macron was still quite new to the European scene. So in 2019, both groups had a very good results, and now they are falling back, but they are still at historically quite good at a quite good level compared to former elections. Finally, the far right, which has been the big buzz in the media, is rising. They continue the growth that they already had before, and actually they will now be stronger than ever before in the European Parliament, although the rise has not been as big as projected in many opinion polls before the election. And then there is a group of parties that are either new to the parliament or, as I said before, some of them are currently non-attached but are trying to find new groups or maybe even form new groups that don't exist so far. Currently, there are 2 possible new groups that might be formed. One of them is a left conservative one around the German alliance Sarah Wagenknecht and possibly the Italian Five Stars movement. The other one could be a new far-right group around the German AfD, which has been expelled from the ID group and is trying to get into another group currently. So there could be up to 2 new groups in the European Parliament, but so far it is not clear whether they will reach the necessary threshold of 23 MEPs from 7 different countries. So it's just as likely that all of these parties will remain non-attached finally in the new parliament. What does that mean for the new majorities? Well, first of all, it's worthwhile to have a look how majority formation works in general in the European Parliament. For this, I have brought here an example of a vote on a regulation of the past legislature. And this is in a way exemplary of many votes in the European Parliament. As you certainly know, there is no clear distinction between government and opposition parties in the European Parliament, but majorities are rather flexible and issue specific. And very often they are based on very large cross-party majorities, the so-called Grand Coalition of the Center, which includes the European People's Party, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and often also the Greens, and in this case, even the left group. They often vote together in order to form these broad majorities. On the other hand, the MEPs from the far-right groups, especially the ID groups, often abstain or are absent, and until now there has been the so-called cordon sanitaire or firewall between the groups of the center and the ID. So the groups of the center do not actively cooperate with the ID group. And finally, it's important to keep in mind that group cohesion in the European Parliament is generally rather low compared with national parliaments. On this particular vote, you can see that group cohesion was actually quite high. There were only few dissenters in the EPP, S&D, and left group, but sometimes the number of dissenters is much higher. And in these cases, the votes of dissenters and also the votes of the non-attached MEPs can be very important and even decisive for the outcome of a vote in the parliament. Of course, this is also the reason why there is always the attempt of forming rather broad majorities to avoid that in the end everything depends just on a couple of dissenters. Now, how did the majority options look in the last parliament, and how will it change in the new one? If we just look at the numbers of the different political groups, we can see that a couple of changes are going to come up in the next 5 years. First of all, looking at this grand coalition of the center, EPP, S&D, and Liberals, or EPP, S&D, and Greens, we see that they will lose some seats, but actually this grand coalition retains a quite sizable majority. You need the 2 biggest groups and then 1 more group of the center in order to form a majority. If we keep in mind this low group cohesion, it might be necessary to have all 4 on board, but if all 4 groups are on board, this majority is still pretty safe if the center holds together. Maybe the most important change from the old parliament to the new one is that in the old parliament there actually also was an alternative majority of the 4 center-left groups, which were very close to a majority, and with the help of a few non-attached MEPs, they could many times be able to build a majority in the parliament without or against the EPP, which was important, especially in climate affairs. So some important decisions of the Green Deal were based on the center-left majority, and also in social and employment affairs, the center-left majority came to the fore several times in the last legislature. In the new legislature, the center-left majority will no longer exist, which of course strengthens the power position of the European People's Party within the parliament. They get a de facto veto position, since no majorities can be formed without them on the left nor on the right. And this may have an impact on well, these issues on which so far the center-left has been the center-left majority has been important, because there are big policy differences between the center-left and the EPP. So, and one of these issues, of course, is the continuation of the Green Deal and the future of climate protection in Europe. On the other hand, the theoretical possibility of a right-wing majority without the Social Democrats will most likely remain just that, a theoretical possibility. Numerically, the right-wing majorities get a bit more likely, but still there is no stable majority without the Social Democrats in the parliament. And politically, they are practically impossible, or at least very, very difficult to form, because on many issues, the liberals and the far right, the ECR, or even part of the EPP and part of the ECR do not agree. And with the ID, there is still this cordon sanitaire anyway. So it will be extremely difficult to form majorities by the center-right or even the far-right in the European Parliament. This may happen sometimes, but it will certainly not be a stable option to build policy on. So what remains is mostly this option of a grand coalition, but still there has been a lot of talk about an opening to the right by the European People's Party during the last weeks. So what is this idea of opening to the right about? It's mostly about the concept of opening the grand coalition towards the right. The European People's Party has proposed now several times to include not all far-right parties and not even all of the ECR group into a majority building, but only some of the ECR member parties. The proclaimed criteria of the EPP are to include parties that are pro-European, pro-Ukraine, and pro-rule of law. Still, this is a very flexible notion. If we look at the parties with which the EPP actually cooperates, we see that many of them are not really pro-European. For example, the Italian governing party, Fratelli d'Italia, is clearly a nationalist party, not a pro-European one. Still, the European People's Party is trying to present these as the more moderate part of the ECR. And they would like to include them into these majority building processes at European level, because this would actually allow the EPP to build majorities around, well, build majorities that are very EPP centered. It would allow the EPP to do without the Greens, for example, and also without the leftmost members of the Social Democrats and Liberals, and build a possible majority in the European Parliament more or less around the EPP's own positions. So this is basically the idea behind this opening to the right. And on the other hand, we see that the other political groups of the center, Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Greens, have reacted very negatively to this idea and are instead now pushing for some kind of coalition agreement with the European People's Party, some clear commitment not to cooperate with the far right, but rather to build a more formal and more stable majority within this grand coalition of the center. So paradoxically, the effect of the rise of the far right and of the conflicts that have been going on among the parties of the political center could be that there will actually be an even closer cooperation than in the past within the centrist coalition in the European Parliament. And I will leave it with that, and I'm looking forward to your questions and well, hoping for an interesting discussion here.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview. Before we open the discussion to questions from the audience, a warm welcome to Dr. Robert Grimm, Head of Public Affairs at Ipsos Germany, who not only has a great expertise in opinion research and knows what was particularly decisive for people when casting their ballot, he can also explain it very well. Robert, I'm looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can see the presentation and that you can hear me. Actually, we, as Ipsos, we conducted a projection before the European election. We also looked at what the main worries, concerns of the Europeans currently are. We explored, we surveyed several thousand respondents in over 16 European countries, and I will show you some of the data right now. Just moving, yeah. So first of all, I'd like to look at whether or not people still think that membership in the European Union is generally a good thing for their country. And you can see here on the left the countries we have surveyed, and on the right you can actually see a more detailed view how people of different age groups and genders, but also respondents who are supporting different political groups or parties, have been answering this question. And we can see relatively quickly, obviously, that support for the European Union, the perception that membership is positive, is still relatively strong. It's about, well, it's roughly 2/3 of the population we surveyed. In some countries as well, above average. In Germany, it's about 65% who considered positive. In Denmark is 71%, but there are other countries, and that's why I actually wanted to flag this up, where this perception that membership in the European Union is not as positive as we thought it should be, namely in Italy and in France, where about, only about half of the population actually said, well, membership in the European Union is good for my country. And in France, there's nearly 1/4, a quarter of the population of the opposite opinion. Similar, the case is similar in Italy. Now, the way in which the work of the European Union is perceived is, less positive. You see that relatively quickly here. Overall, about 37% of our respondents said the European Union has done a good job in the past. Here again, there are great variations. Germany with 41% positive perception, Denmark 54%. So actually, in general, by the way, Scandinavian countries are very positive when it comes to the European Union. And here again, France only at 18%. 18% of the respondents said the European Union has done a good job, and 36% of the opposite opinion. Equally in the Czech Republic, very negative perception, and perhaps less surprising in Hungary. Now, what are the biggest drivers of the biggest worries, the priorities, the policy priorities the European Union should have in the eyes of the European population? The fight against rising prices came out very, very high in our survey. 68% said this should be a real priority in the coming years. Reduction of social inequality and preservation of social protection systems came out with 64%. Supporting economic growth, 62%. Fighting against illegal immigration, 59%. Now, I found this interesting because if we add to this fight against unemployment, 57%, we can see relatively quickly that there's an overwhelming support for economic policies that actually bring about prosperity and growth and make the European Union competitive. So it's a bit back to the roots, because the initial idea of the European Union, of course, was an economic one. Now, migration figures high here also, and I think that in part explains why the far-right parties have gained so much support. But what I found also interesting, and equally interesting, is that the fight against climate change is still considered to be important, but relative to the other policy priorities, it figures not as high as we thought it would or should be. Okay. Now, I also looked at different elements. I can't quite see this actually because this iron is important for just a second. We explored. I've got to make this a little bit smaller because it's in the view of the title, unfortunately. Yes, okay. Good. Going back maybe. Yes, okay. So I'm looking at some of them in more detail. The fight against rising prices is very important in Greece, Austria, and Spain, Belgium, but less so in Denmark and in Poland, equally also not in Germany. Still 68% in Germany think that fight against rising prices should be a priority. But if we look at migration, here the picture actually changes. Migration, we know, is a massive worry. It's the top of mind worry in the German population at the moment, and so it is in the Netherlands. And again, I've got to say, this very much explains why, especially in Germany, the Greens have lost so many votes, but the far right has gained so many votes, namely the AfD. So in Germany, you have 65% of the population who believe that the European Union should emphasize its fight against illegal migration. And in the Netherlands, it's even 70%, Portugal 64%, and the Czech Republic 63%. Now, unemployment is also an interesting element because it does show you variations about the economic situation of different member states. We know that unemployment is not a major issue in countries like Germany, Denmark, or the Netherlands, partly because we still have nearly full employment in these countries. But we also have member states like, for instance, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Italy, where unemployment is still a major issue, where especially youth unemployment is high. And I think the general unemployment rate in countries like Spain is above 10%. So in these countries, the emphasis on the fight against unemployment and economic growth is much higher than in other countries. Now, climate change, I wanted to pick that up because it is a major worry in some of the European countries, but not in all. I've shown that before, so it only came in as, I think, the 5th most important priority for the new European Parliament or the European Union. And we can see here also a very diverse picture, some sort of polarization, with people in Denmark, Portugal, and Sweden seeing it as a major issue, but others, like for instance Slovakia and Finland, but also Austria, perceiving the fight against climate change as not a major priority for the forthcoming European Parliament. Now, the war in Ukraine, of course, has moved us all. In the past few years, there's just been a big donor conference here in Germany. Zelensky was in Berlin, I think earlier during the weekend, and it moves the European Union, the European Commission, the conflict we have at our borders, and of course the continuous aid to Ukraine is of great concern. But again, what I find interesting looking at the data is that the opinion is very, very diverse. It's very polarizing. So we have countries that are relatively close to the conflict, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, who believe that continuous aid to Ukraine should be a major priority of the forthcoming European Parliament, of the European Union in the coming years. But then there are other countries, like for instance Romania, Slovakia, and Italy, where that actually plays a minor role. So overall, I think when we look at different policy areas, the European Union is very much divided. And this is in part explained by either geographic proximity when it comes to the conflict, or it is in part explained with the economic and social situation within each nation state. Okay, now looking back, we ask our respondents, well, what do you believe was the impact of the European Union on various issues? The fight against COVID is an obvious one, for war in Ukraine, environmental protection, economic growth, the protection of the European agriculture and European food independence, and migration policy. Interesting picture here. We've said there was a rise in the far right, although it wasn't as big as political projections were making out it would be ahead of the election, but still Europeans believe that the European Union had a very little or a negative impact actually when it comes to migration control. Equally, to some degree, economic growth, I said it was one of the major policy areas where respondents, Europeans, saw policy priorities. But we can see here that only about 1/3, actually a little bit more than 1/3, believe that the European Union has had good, positive, forgive me, a negative impact on economic growth. Now, this is looking ahead. You know, one of the challenges, I think, is within the European Union is very often power sharing, and I really like this slide because it actually explains what, or the way in which respondents, people in individual member states, they envision the cooperation between the nation state and the European Union, whether they are willing to share some of their sovereignty. And most people in France, 63%, believe that the best way to move forward to address the major issues the European Union is facing currently, whether or not it's economic growth or migration, believe that the best way forward is to strengthen the national decision-making rather than referring more power to the European Union. And this is equal in some Eastern European countries, namely the Czech Republic. We know that the Czech Republic is quite Eurosceptic, but also Bulgaria. So you have 56% of the population who believe that strengthening member states, national governments, vis-a-vis the European Centre will actually lead to better policy outcomes. In other countries, it's reverse, looking at Denmark, Belgium, Germany and Sweden, but also the Netherlands. Here, it is less than half of the population who actually think that we should, or their national government should refer more power towards Europe. So an interesting, very diverse picture. I think what comes out most of the times when we look at the data is that, you know, and I think to some degree that's very surprising, is that countries who used to be the founding member states of the European Union, namely France and Italy, are very skeptic when it comes to the positive impact, the positive outcome that is generated through membership and the power sharing within the Union. Okay, and last, a point about the possibility of enlargement. There are lots of debates whether or not Ukraine should in the future be integrated into a larger European Union, be part of the European family. And in actual fact, there is some support among Europeans. 45% of Europeans believe that or support the idea that Ukraine should become a European member state in the future. But there's also some opposition. About 35% oppose that idea. When it comes to other countries that are perhaps closer to this process, actually there's little support. So Ukraine has most support when it comes to membership. And here again, the European Union, when it comes to the opinion within individual countries, is actually quite polarized. We see that countries that are closer to the conflict, Finland, Sweden, but also Poland, and to some degree, perhaps surprising also Iberian countries, are very supportive of the idea of Ukraine becoming a member in the European Union. But then again, other countries, and here we have France again, but also Germany, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, perceive this as rather negative and oppose the idea. Okay, and perhaps one last slide. We also asked respondents whether or not they could, if they had a choice, whether or not they could tell us what sort of policy area they would prioritize if they had the choice, for instance, between climate change and purchasing power. And surprisingly, actually, there were some countries, especially northern countries, Denmark and Sweden, but also Italy and Spain, that had suffered from climate change more recently, that were where we have a majority, or where the respondents, the country is closer to the majority in supporting action against climate change over purchasing power. But actually in the majority of European member states, respondents felt that policies combating or improving purchasing power should be prioritized in the next European Parliament. So in summary, I would like to say that looking at the data, Europeans voted pro-European, and our data has actually been showing that most Europeans are still seeing the advantages of their countries being a member state. But at the same time, there are big and great variations within the European Union. Most Europeans wish economic or policies that actually drive economic growth and improve general prosperity and competitiveness within Europe. So it's the economy that is on people's minds. But again, there are variations and differences because some countries really struggle with or perceive inflows of migration as the greatest challenge, namely Germany and the Netherlands. And when it comes to enlargement, well, there's some support, particularly for the Ukraine to become a member state in the European Union. But that too depends on each individual nation state. And I close with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Very interesting, particularly your last slide, but we will talk about this maybe later. To start with a question for both of you. When Manuel talked about the possible coalition or cooperation agreement, when you negotiate about an agreement, each side has to make concessions, and not only each side, but maybe even the Commission President, the candidate. So, Robert, Manuel, where do you see the concessions that need to be done on the left side when we're talking maybe about the S&D, and on the right side when we're talking about the EPP, and where do you see some common ground? And maybe particularly, because this is, for us, the eFuel Alliance, particularly climate priority and policies are the main area that are of relevance for us. Who first?
Well, go ahead.
Well, this I think is a very it's quite a difficult question, but obviously we should be the experts able to, and we should be able to answer to some degree. I think I believe that to an extent, some governments have been governing or have not been really included the worries and issues and problems, the very mundane problems people face in their everyday lives. And let's take the point. Let's take migration, for instance. I think migration is a real concern in Germany and in many other countries too. And I believe that in the area of migration, on the level of the nation state, but also on the level of the European Union, there needs to be some, I wouldn't say we should move towards the opinion and policy areas or policy objectives of the right, but I think we need to embrace some of these ideas. I think, the European Union needs to make sure that the population within Europe is convinced that the European Union is able to protect its borders. And I think that is an element where the left has to shift towards, perhaps not shift, but look right in order to be able to continue with some more concerning and burning issues, like, for instance, climate change. Sorry, it was a long-winded answer.
All fine. Manuel,
well, I think it's a very difficult and political question in the end, because of course there are also value questions that play an important role, both with regard to migration and with regard to climate change, and therefore the clashes on these issues have been very real, I think. And to a degree, of course, the rise of the far right has also impacted the public debate. With this regard of how far migration is perceived as a problem or as a chance, an opportunity, because in a way it is both, of course. And there is also a need to have more migration to Europe from an economic perspective. In my opinion, there has been a certain kind of shift of the discourse to the right, which then has been spiraling, of course, also the number of vote of far right parties, I think the parties of the center left are now standing for the decision whether to shift their policy or whether to invest more in shifting the discourse back, which of course is a problematic decision to make in a way. On climate change, I think there too have been very clear political clashes now before the European Parliament election, especially with regard of the relation between climate change and agriculture. There have been these farmers' protests in many member states, and of course in this context also the EPP on the one hand and many center-left and especially Green parties on the other hand have grown further apart policy-wise. So in this area too, I think it will be challenging to find common ground. But on the other hand, I mean, this is exactly what coalition talks usually are about. So in my view, what the European Parliament and the political parties in the European Parliament actually would need right now is more time to talk about these issues that separate them and to try to find this common ground. It's very difficult in my views to do this on their behalf as an expert, but because it's such an entrenched political question. But as an expert, what I would say is that they need this time now, which of course is also a political question right now, because there's also a lot of pressure to just get over with it and elect von der Leyen as Commission President as soon as possible and so on. So this is where I would kind of come out with my own opinion, that I think in this question of whether now time is most of the matter and we have to move on quickly in order to have institutional certainty, or whether the parliament should take some time and allow political groups to negotiate amongst themselves in order to get a stable agreement for the next years. I think this latter issue is the more important one, and that therefore there shouldn't be too much pressure now time-wise on the European Parliament.
Mm. Maybe that's the last point, because we mentioned climate change, and I think when I look at our data, we have a data set. It's called "What Worries the World." We survey very regularly quite a few European member states about their main concerns, people's main concerns, and actually climate change very often figures high, and so do economic questions. And I think the interesting issue would be to marry combating climate change with economic growth and competitiveness. Because I think that most parties in the center agree that climate change is an issue, and most political parties agree that we need some sort of an economic growth agenda. But how that comes about, I think that's the big debate, isn't it? I mean, does it either come through investment and regulation, investment through the state and regulation through the state, or does it actually come about through market forces? And my sense is that is also a big debate at the heart of the European Union. And I think that actually, since the parliament has been shifting to the right, not fundamentally, but it has been shifting to the right, that perhaps now the discussion will also go more into a market-led climate transformation rather than a top-down government and regulation-led climate transformation. So that's where I would see the new policy agendas.
Thank you, Robert. Very interesting. I mean, also saying that economic growth was quite up on the list, it might suggest, yes, we want climate change, but the weight, oh no, we don't want climate change. We want climate policy, sorry.
Yeah.
We want climate policy, but the way it is done doesn't provide for economic growth. Maybe this is how the perception was with some of the voters, if economic growth is so high on the agenda. But maybe let's move to the other questions, because there are some more questions. Coming back to this agreement, Manuel, that you just mentioned, that we need an agreement. So you said that the EPP is in a power position. Having this in mind, and then looking at one of the questions here in the chat, I will read it out, is that does the concept of the coalition in the European Parliament even really exist? It seems that the EP must just appoint the EC president and then the entire commission, but thereafter the coalition doesn't really exist. The European Commission can get support on a case-by-case on individual fights, asked Tomasz Wlostowski. And so my question is, do we really need the, or his and my question combined, do we really need this cooperation agreement? And does the EPP actually want a written cooperation agreement?
It's a very fair point, because of course this has been the tradition of the European Parliament, that the majorities have been very issue specific, and that have always been negotiated on a case by case way. I think what has changed is that in the past well, let's say the democratic spectrum, or let's put it differently, the far right has grown that much during the last years, which of course means that the democratic spectrum has become more narrow, and that there are more parties now in the European Parliament with which it is difficult to cooperate. And this idea of the EPP of opening to the right, to include some of the far right parties in majority building, in order to be more flexible and in order to be able to forge these compromises based on, well, basically their own program, have been received with a lot of mistrust from the center left, and I think with good reason. And now the problem is how this mistrust among the parties in the political center can be overcome, because of course the Commission, once elected, stays in power for 5 years, except there is a 2/3 majority in the parliament against them. But they still need to find a majority again and again. And if there is too much mistrust among the parties in the center, it will be difficult to find these majorities. So in order to be able to act, the parliament has to reestablish this trust among the center parties. And in my views, a written coalition agreement would be the best way to achieve this. Of course, in the last 10-15 years, there have already been some agreements also among parties of the center in the European Parliament. They did not amount to a full-fledged coalition agreement as we know them from the national level, but it's not something completely new. Rather, the political groups have already seen this need of kind of formalizing at least partly their cooperation in order to increase trust specifically. And I think that this now with the increased share of the far right becomes more and more necessary also in the European Parliament.
Robert, anything you would like to add? Or I would have actually a question to you if you don't want to add anything. So, sorry, I think you said you want the next question.
Sorry, go ahead with the question.
Okay,
Yeah.
but it's a bit more eFuels specific. I don't know if you're able to answer it.
I try my best.
Perfect, but we are the eFuel Alliance, so at the end. Fabrice Vidal asks, out of any cost consideration, do you believe European Parliament has a consciousness that e-fuels can be part of the climate solution. Same questions with cost consideration. So basically, or maybe the parliament and the people. So is there an awareness that e-fuels, when we're talking about costs, you know, cost of living, purchasing power, economic growth, is there this awareness that e-fuels actually can be part of the solution?
Yeah. It's a difficult one because, you see, what we do is we measure public opinion. And I would say when it comes to awareness among the public, what e-fuels actually are and what they can do and what they can achieve, my hypothesis would be interesting to run a survey once, is that not many people actually know what it is and how it can contribute and what sort of, you know, compared to, let's say, or electric vehicles, purely electric vehicles. And partly because I think there's been so much discussion in Germany about, not Germany, but Europe in general, about electrification. So I think there's limit in the general public. That's what's important. There's less awareness about the possibilities what e-fuels can actually achieve. There will be some awareness, but less. Then again, when you talk about the European Parliament, I suspect that, of course, you know, since these people will be experts and will permanently confronted with some very important choices, policy choices, of course, they will be informed, and there will be a degree of awareness. Whether or not they push for that may largely depend on the political majorities or the political affiliations they have within their member states. That would be my response to that.
There are two more questions, but I will start with the one first, talking about exactly what you just mentioned, Robert, and going back to the Parliament. So there's, unfortunately, anonymous, there's a question about the Fit for 55, the compromises. You were talking about migration, but when it comes to the Fit for 55 files, what could be the future of transport and climate regulation, such as the ones on the CO2 standards? Just to explain to you, this is the one where the decision was taken to ban the internal combustion engine. What will this be in? What will the next 5 years be mean for this? So basically, do you see a chance? Because you just mentioned that it was a big topic in Germany. The EPP party in Germany, CDU, CSU, ran a campaign on that. So do you think the ICE ban, such a strong topic to have it corrected, it is such a big topic for the EPP that there is a chance the next European Parliament might open the regulation to make it more inclusive, to have alongside electric vehicles also renewable fuels to decarbonize road?
Yeah, there was indeed a survey in Germany about that, but I think it backfired really, really badly, if I remember right. You know, again, it's a very difficult question. I think you have to think ahead a little bit if you think about Germany. But obviously, Germany is not the only country within the European Union. There are lots of many other countries with very specific political situations. But if we think of Germany, then we have to think of 2025. I think it's very likely. I'm not going to give up any predictions, but you know, it's not unlikely, let's put it this way, that we will have a coalition between the Green Party and the CDU, the Christian Democrats. And I think within that constellation, that ban is not going to go.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind. I mean, I'm not a environmental policy expert or a climate policy expert, but I think two things to keep in mind actually. That the ICE ban has been a big issue in Germany, but not much so in other member states. So it's not something that really people care that much about outside Germany. And the other thing, which I think is important, is that if you want to establish new EU legislation, you always need a qualified majority in the council. So it is not enough just to have a majority, you need a qualified majority. So it is quite difficult at the European level to have new legislation. But this also means that it is also difficult to repel existing legislation and to change existing legislation. So once something has been decided, it is also not so easy to get rid of it, because then you need a qualified majority again in order to get rid of it. And if it was difficult in the first place to get the qualified majority to have it, it will also be difficult to have the qualified majority to abolish it again. Which in my view means that it will, in general, with regard to the Green Deal legislation, with the existing conflicts within the political center, it is very well possible that there will not be as much new legislation over the next 5 years, but it will also be difficult to abolish the existing legislation of the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And maybe one last question, a more general one. So one also anonymous, unfortunately, is asking, is it so surprising that countries which traditionally see themselves as powers and also founding fathers of Europe, like Italy and France, are frustrated about the power sharing? Question mark. What impact can this have on the future of the European construction if we can learn some lessons from Brexit as well? Well, maybe first to Manuel Müller, because I think this is particularly your field of expertise.
Yes, I mean it's certainly a very broad question, because in the end it goes to the issue of well, this general shift in with regard to the European Union and the crises that the European Union has suffered. I think that this well, increased Euroscepticism in many countries, or this also often goes hand in hand with a certain national populism, and again with the rise of the far right. Started in a way in the 1990s already, and then got a big boost with the Euro crisis, where the EU had difficulties to get a solution to the crisis, and remarkably, the attempts to solve these big crises, because Euro crisis, of course, was only the first, and then there was a lot of other crises. That's why we speak about the poly crisis or the perma crisis of the European Union by now. And whenever there is a big crisis, the EU lacks the legislative power to deal with it, it falls back to the European Council and the heads of state and government, because they are the ones who well, normally control national governments and can try to coordinate national answers to European crisis when the EU doesn't have the legislative competence to act on its own. So by the crises, the European Council has become more important, and there has been a certain shift towards intergovernmentalism and cooperation rather than regular EU legislation. And this intergovernmental procedures often do not work as well, I would say, as the ordinary legislative procedure, in the sense that the strong presence of the heads of state and governments highlights national interests rather than common European interests. When the heads of state and governments negotiate about what to do, everybody expects that the own national leader should defend the own national interests. And of course, in the Euro crisis specifically, there was a lot of conflict going on between the member states. And this, in a way, then is also fueling this new nationalist sentiment. Talking about how to change this, in my view, strengthening European democracy is actually a good way also to increase again trust in the European Union. But of course, this is difficult when the public mood is rather going into the other direction and is claiming to get back more power to the member states. But since Brexit was mentioned in the question, my impression is that the big lesson that was learned from Brexit is that actually not having the European Union is also no solution. So in most member states, Brexit was actually seen as a big failure for the United Kingdom, and we could see that in the Eurobarometer, for example, the support for the European Union went up a lot in most member states immediately after the Brexit, when it became clear what problem it was for the United Kingdom to deal with that. So I think that this, in a way, also shows that despite this new national populism and despite this surge of the far right, most people in Europe are also aware that the European Union is actually important, that it is needed. And now the question will simply be for EU politicians to give policy answers to get over the crises, and to show again that the EU is able to solve problems, and in the best cases, to even have institutional reform in order to overcome this current European Council crisis intergovernmentalism and get back towards more regular legislation at EU level.
Thank you, Manuel, for this very comprehensive answer. We have another part, so I think we have to that we still want to cover. So I think we have to make a break for the time being, but I would just like to mention, if of interest to you, thank you, Nicolas, for telling us that the ICE ban has been a major topic during the French EU election campaign as well, not only in Germany. I didn't know that, so now we do. Thank you, Nicolas, for that. Robert, Manu, thank you very much. You're, of course, very welcome to stay here in our webinar, but now we will move on to Ralf Diemer, CEO of the eFuel Alliance, who will present for us, now having the elections happened, and the next EU political cycle in front of us, what we see as the priorities for the next 5 years and for eFuels. Ralf, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Algara. Thanks, first of all, to our two speakers for the very insightful presentations and also the Q&A. We have some slides, or I have some slides for you concerning also the regulatory side and how we think and also how we work on to pursue in the next legislative period. I mean, clearly, I think one of the issues which was not only the ICE ban, but maybe a general perception, and that was, I think, not only a perception in Germany. I mean, if you think there was a Czech party of automobile mobilists who actually ran the election on the ICE ban and came out as number 3 in the election, if I'm not mistaken. But there was a general perception that the Green Deal itself too much stressed on environmental issues. That was in addition also to a lot of environmental regulations, for example, in the agricultural sector, where we had a lot of demonstrations going on in Brussels and all over Europe, and not enough on to strengthen the economy in Europe. And I think this is something this somehow has to be adjusted, and that is also something, for example, Mrs. von der Leyen already stated in several statements. On the other hand, of course, we as eFuel Alliance have a huge interest that climate policy stays, and we are believing that eFuels, and we are sure that eFuels will play a major role here. Clearly, I would say Robert is right to a certain extent that, of course, not everybody out there knows what eFuels are, but we are working on that since 4 years now, and we see also in various surveys done on European level, but also national level, that the awareness is rising, and that we see that more and more people understand that we will need those fuels to fly, to ship goods or people, and also to drive goods or people in the future, as well as we need other technical solutions to come to our goal to be climate neutral at least in 2050. Now, I think what is very important and what we have to take into account as well, besides the majorities or the situation in the European Parliament, is of course the formation of the European Commission as well. Then it was because it was pointed out totally accurate that at the end only the Commission can be initiative when it comes to new legislation. So clearly, however the majority in the European Parliament is at the end, there will be no vote on anything if the European Commission is not coming up with proposals. Of course, member states play an important role. If a vast majority or a big number of big member states are stating certain wishes on new legislation, then of course this puts pressure on the European Commission. But at the end of the day, the Commission itself, and especially which people, which personalities will be commissioners for certain issues, is of key. I mean, clearly, when you see the last Commission, the Green Deal would have looked differently if instead of Mr. Timmermans, a social democrat from the Netherlands, maybe a Polish member of the party of Donald Tusk would have been the climate commissioner. So very clear, Commission and commissioners have a lot of power, especially when it comes to legislation. And of course, after the Parliament is formed, there will be then this process, which you see on this slide, where first of all, the Commission President has to be voted on. That's of course the most important part in the first place. And then during the rest of the year, the member states come up with proposals for persons. And then of course, there are the question which portfolio which will come to which person from which party family, I would assume is also part of the negotiations amongst the different groups in the European Parliament. Because of course, the question again, which party the climate commissioner in the future will be on is of course very important. And there we also work on those hearings because already the hearings in the European Parliament, the questions and the statements of the commissioners, the future commissioners, will play a role in their policy and also on the working program of the European Commission. And then, of course, if you will, the good thing about European legislation is after the goal is before the goal. So we had this set of regulations done under the Green Deal in the last legislative period. We made a lot of progress, so it's a mixed picture. We cannot say that the Green Deal in general is a failure or is, so to speak, wrong. There are many regulations which are important to promote e-fuels and hydrogen. If the regulations for the maritime sector or the refuel EU aviation, for example, but also in general, the Renewable Energy Directive are regulations which are overall good. They are not perfect, though. They are maybe not ambitious enough. And the overall regulatory set we have in place right now is still not supportive enough to trigger those billions of investments which we need into the industrialized production of e-fuels all over the globe. So still Europe is not a sufficient target market for those fuels. And Europe still is not a sufficient hub even for those investments. So there is a lot of work to do. And here on this slide, you just see the timetable when the certain revisions are planned. So in every law, in every regulation, you have a revision clause and bound to a year. And of course, there will be also additional legislations coming up. For example, the questions of funding of hydrogen projects and e-fuel projects will be raising issue in the future in the next 5 years, simply because it's very clear that we need more funding to promote those projects. And then, of course, there is this very question of some legislations where we really believe they are simply wrong, and that is the ban of combustion engines. So it's not for us about saving the combustion engine in the first place. We never, as eFuel Alliance, started to save the combustion engine. The issue is that the road transport sector is the only sector where you have a very high willingness to pay. Why? Because there is no global competition. A driver in Brussels doesn't compete price-wise, fuel price-wise with a driver in Tokyo. This is very different with airlines and very different with aviation. And this is, by the way, also very different, for example, with industry. I mean, we try hydrogen-based steel production to install in Europe, which is absolutely necessary. But of course, steel is in a huge global competition, and there is no willingness to pay these additional high investments into these technologies, and therefore they have to be subsidized because otherwise they wouldn't happen. This is different in road transport, and that is why we think that we have to overcome this ban of combustion engines. We are for minus 100% CO2 emissions in 2035. We never disputed this target. We just dispute the way how this target is achieved with this regulation right now by only promoting and only allowing electricity and electric solutions. We think that is the point. And the very question would be now, of course, there will be a review in 2026. This might be too late for some also political players since they went on campaigns for that. And then again, if you want to revise the ban of combustion engine, you at the end of the day need a commission proposal to do so. And a new commission could bring up this proposal right after coming into power, so meaning early next year. Will they do that? I don't know. This is something we will have to see and work on. But clearly, if political coalitions are built and if a change also in this Green Deal construction in certain areas have to be implemented, then this has to be done. By the way, the same goes for the famous delegated acts of the Renewable Energy Directive, which are actually right now, because they are too tight and too bureaucratic and too complicated, actually hindering investments when it comes to e-fuels and fuel production. Last slide here, our priorities. We just wanted to point out, most of it I already said. Of course, it's not only about these regulations. The European regulatory set is very important because it's also the most advanced regulatory set we have in the world. So when, for example, the Japanese look into their e-fuel strategy and think how they could regulate, for example, renewable energies and how could they define renewable energies, then they look into the Renewable Energy Directive, and most likely they will find there also some examples which they can copy. The same goes for the Americans when they discuss now the guidelines on the Inflation Reduction Act. The very question is, of course, should they follow one by one, because overall, as I said, it's partly too bureaucratic and too complicated what we do, and they shouldn't. But of course, European regulators are important, and that goes also for international standards, because e-fuels are a global issue. We won't produce e-fuels only in Europe. There will be many better and advanced places in the world where you can produce e-fuels much cheaper and in much higher amounts, simply because renewable electricity is much more cheap. For that, of course, we need more international approach when it comes, for example, to standards. I think this is a very important task for the next Commission, and there has to be more initiatives in that respect. Last but not least, the Renewable Energy Directive goes until 2030. The CO2 standards for cars goes until 2035. The refuel EU maritime and aviation regulation are going further. So we have very different timelines here, and definitely the timelines have to be adjusted in a way that we get more long-term perspective. The Renewable Energy Directive until 2030 is simply too short. That has to be prolonged, ideally until 2050, with the respective targets in the roadmap, because we're talking here long time investments, and at the end of the day, they need a lot of time and a proper timeline to have the security. Last but not least, what we cannot stress enough, it is at the end not a debate about only planes, only ships, or only cars. We will have many applications where we will need e-fuels when we want to be climate neutral, because simply electric solutions are either not available or too expensive. And therefore, the eFuel Alliance stands for a cross-sectoral approach. We really believe that airlines have to have an interest that road transport is not excluded by the uptake of these investments and the industrialized production of e-fuels. And that is something we hope to can work further and maybe even a little bit better with the new parliament and the new commission, with then slightly different majorities. But that waits to be seen. We will be successful there at the end of the day. That's maybe in a nutshell from my side. I thank you very much for your interest. And of course, if you have some additional questions, I'm also here to answer them.
Thank you very much, Ralf. Actually, there is one question in the chat, a very specific one from Fabrice. Fabrice asks you if you believe that CO2 will be transported from one country to another in order to fulfill regulatory requirements to build e-fuels.
Yeah, Fabrice, that's a very good question, actually. Maybe a two-way answer. First of all, I think it's crucial that we enter into a CO2 market anyway. Clearly, when we phase out oil out of production of fuels in general, if we have a hydrogen-based renewable fuel value chain, we need CO2 sources. Of course, in an ideal world, that would be direct air capturing technologies, but we are not there yet. The technologies exist. They have to be pursued. They have to be invested in, but they are not economically feasible right now. And of course, since we are emitting a lot of CO2, especially also in industrial areas where the elimination of these emissions is not easy. Think about cement, for example. We should use carbon capture and carbon capture utilization technologies to use these CO2 sources for the production of these products. Now, we have a regulation, the so-called Delegated Act on, I think it's Article 28, dealing with the CO2 sources. And there is a particular part which says that if you are produce e-fuels outside of Europe and you use a CO2 point source, for example, of cement, you are allowed to export these fuels to Europe only if this cement production is in a, so says the regulation, the emission trading system comparable pricing system. Of course, in most parts of the world, this kind of pricing system doesn't exist. So we had just one example, to what that leads then at the end of the day. We have one member which is in the making of a production in Morocco. They had two alternatives, getting CO2 from a cement production in Morocco. But of course, there is no emission trading system and no comparable pricing system. So what they do now is they capture the CO2 from a cement production in Spain and export it to Morocco for the fuel producer. So that's the kind of regulation we have to get rid of, because it's just wrong to start with. And in the second place, it makes things complicated, and sometimes it makes investments impossible, because if you are not able to import those fuels or to export those fuels to Europe, then you are losing a huge target market, and of course then maybe also your investment.
Thank you very much, Ralf. So when it comes to the new EC mandate, I think we will basically, as you said, we want a technology inclusive approach, and we are happy, and we completely stand for the 100% of the CO2 reductions for cars, and we are happy to work with everyone that is following this approach, to be open for all solutions that are available to decarbonize road transport. I think, looking at the time, we have come to an end. I would like to thank everybody for their participations, for the very valuable insights, and for the questions from the audience. Thank you very much, gentlemen, dear participants, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much. Same to you. Speak to you soon.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.